Hey everyone, today we are tearing down the NVIDIA RTX 3070 Founders Edition card. Quite a bit different from the 3080 and 3090 FE cards. We have a separate video on those. The first time we took apart the 3080 FE, it involved a drill, which we can show a flashback of now. So the 3070 FE should be a bit easier. We have a separate review that should be on the channel already at the time this goes up. If you'd like to see our performance review, thermals, noise, all that stuff, that will be on the channel already. But now we're just going to take it apart and look at the assembly quality. Before that, this video is brought to you by the Be Quiet PureBase 500DX. The PureBase 500DX is a new push from Be Quiet into mesh fronted cases that are more thermally focused. The 500DX maintains high build quality and attention to detail for its dust filters, front panel installation, and fan placement, and still has additional focus on noise control. The case comes with three 140mm PureWanes 2 fans stock and has RGB LEDs, but with a physical hardware switch for easy control. Learn more about the Be Quiet PureBase 500DX at the link in the description below. We'll start with an exterior walkthrough of things. Again, thermal analysis will be in the review video, so this has all been tested at this point. I do, however, need to add some thermocouples to the card for memory and VRM MOSFET testing, so we're going to be doing that after this teardown. First thing I'd like to point out is that the back of this card gets very dirty very quickly because of it's kind of a weird design, but very slight, like 1mm grooves throughout the thing. So it's not paint, these are actually grooves. And that unfortunately means that a bunch of debris gets caught in it. I put this down on the mat, which is dirtied from years of teardowns, and that happened immediately. So great for trapping dust for sure, but otherwise not so much. So cooling wise, a couple of changes here. One thing we need to figure out is if this split goes all the way down to the board or if it's got a gap underneath it. We'll figure that out pretty quickly once it's apart. The holes on this one are plugged on the side, so those are plugged with screws this time. Does not appear that those are actually, I'm looking down this channel on the card, you're not gonna be able to see it on camera I don't think, but it doesn't appear that they're actually connecting to anything. I think they're just literal plugs, and they don't look necessary to be removed for this. For other screws, there's Torx. So we've got 1, 2, this is our QR, that's not NVIDIA's, so you don't have to worry about that. But 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 Torx on the back. This is a good thing where they've got the perforated panel, the I/O panel. Oh, it's interesting, they moved all of their requirements for the various certifications and standards to the I/O slot. So a lot of the time this appears on the PCB under the backplate. Always have kind of wondered silently whether that's sufficient to satisfy the demands of these various organizations, government organizations, but it looks like they've moved it to the I/O plate so they're visible externally. Anyway, this is for breathing, and then there's 1, 2, 3, 4 screws for that. That looks like it's gonna have to come out, those screws probably. I think that's the rest. That's all the screws I'm seeing. The fans, let's start with measurement of those. So fans are roughly, they would be 85s, which are often called 90 or 93, but 85s, except they're technically a little bit smaller than that because by doing this fan housing around the edge, it helps to focus the airflow more downward, but you do lose a little bit, like an extra millimeter of space or so at the edge where there could be a longer blade. So there's a bit of a trade-off there, but that's something we discussed in the original teardowns. For the cable this time, it's another 12-pin, except it only goes to one 6+2 this time. And let's just start taking this thing apart. So this is either a Torx 9 or 10. Some of my bits have gotten mixed up over the years. I'm thinking that's a 9, but it was in the 10 slot. I'm going to track these screws on the mod mat, which you can grab on store.gamersnexus.net. Haven't been able to keep them stocked over the years because they are one of our most popular items along with the mouse mats, but you can back order it on store.gamersnexus.net if you'd like to. Okay, let's see how easy this is. Cool, easy enough. All right, so there's 2 little clips right here. Plastic, be careful if you take yours apart not to push it the wrong way. So you just lift and then pull back towards the fins and then it comes out. There is a thermal pad, to NVIDIA's credit, Let's see if it contacts the plastic or if it's actually contacting something useful. Seriously? I mean, I'm sure NVIDIA's thermal team's like, it doesn't matter. But I just don't like seeing designs that could be so obviously better. As you can see, so this plastic is here specifically to prevent shorting. It's normal, you actually want it there. So the reason it's normally there is because if you put the backplate down as just metal, especially if it's not anodized metal, contacting other components, legs, like you can see the legs of maybe that might be an inductor or something sticking through there. So when it contacts that, you could have a direct short. That's bad, you don't want that. So they put plastic on it to insulate against an electrical short, but you still want to conduct for thermal reasons, and that's where thermal pads come in with direct contact to the metal part, and this is an aluminum backplate. So I would like to have seen this directly on the metal for optimal performance. To be fair, this thermal pad doesn't do a whole lot to begin with, but adding a couple of these where the memory is can help bring down the temperature by a couple degrees in some cases. It depends on the cooler, but that's typically what we've seen is a couple degree reduction. In some cases with the really hot, like G6X memory, where you have a lot of it double stacked, it really makes a difference where you're beyond a couple degrees. It might be like 5-6 degrees, depending on the cooler. So we'd like to see more thermal pads in use. This is clearly where it looks like it's the size of like a memory module, but that, to me, that looks like inductors and MOSFETs. So I'm thinking it's on the backside of the VRM. We'll find out soon. But this looks like an afterthought. To me, this looks like a live running manufacturing change where NVIDIA did not plan to have any thermal pads, found out that for some reason it needed one, and threw one on there without cutting the plastic because maybe the backplates were already manufactured at this point. So that's what it looks like to me. Would have loved to see a bit more efficiency in the design there, so that's not a great start. Just small attention to detail stuff they shouldn't be screwing up at this point. So we're back to the ribbon cables, which are smaller. That's probably why they're using them. But you have a lot fewer connection cycles with these. They wear out fast. You lift the black lip there to release it and then push the cable out. See if there are any others so don't break them. Yep, there is actually one more. Always look over for these types of cables because they break so easily. NVIDIA is the only company I know of that does this on modern video cards. All right, so 2 cables, both disconnected. We can see a shunt resistor here. Let's just go ahead and double check this against PCIe. So almost definitely this shunt resistor is going to the PCIe slot. Where is it? There's a 12 pin there, or 12 volt. So that's 12 volt. So it's that shunt resistor corresponds to the PCIe slot. If you do a shunt resistor mod, you're going to short shunt resistors. We would strongly advise that you do not short any that correspond with the PCIe slot because it can only take so much power and it's not worth it. And you could blow out the 24 pin or the motherboard slot. Okay, we've got a controller here. Is that a UP? It is 9512R. Okay, those are on a couple other cards out there as well. Let's get the retention kit off, and also this screw needs to come out. It looks like it's all torqued so far. Same size, at least, to NVIDIA's credit. That is in fact the same size torque screw. That's good. Put this over here on the mat. And how about this one? Nope, can't have them all be the same size. This is from the GN toolkit. This is a T6, Torque 6 driver from our toolkit. Interesting. No retention on this. It is not a captive screw. A lot of times you'll see captive screws for these. Did have Loctite on it though. It's also interesting that this is horizontal this time instead of vertical. That to me looks like the die size should be different, but also likely that the board, the PCB is so small that they needed to arrange it a certain way. So no springs for retention. Last time the spec was 2 to 2.5 inch-pounds of force for those screws as provided by NVIDIA. Okay, so we paused there for a minute so I could wire it all up before we further disassembled it. That way I could run thermal testing with thermocouples without having to redo the paste. So that testing's done now. We've come back and I removed the probes and it's time to finish this teardown. So I think at this point, yep, we should be able to separate things. I am going to have to remove the backplate or the IO, well, you maybe slide it out, but it's going to be better to remove this first. So let's orient this way. That's, to NVIDIA's credit, at least the same size screw. So they've moved away from the tiny, really tiny screws in the original 20 series, which is a good change. NVIDIA used a bunch of like Phillips 00, 000, and 00 screws where they were very easy to strip if you weren't careful and if you weren't using exactly the right screwdriver. So they have moved away from that. These are, I'm still getting some free spin there, but it's a lot better. Okay, there's that removed. Board will come out now. Completely free. Okay, cool. So, upside of doing the fan cables on the back with ribbons is that once they're removed, you don't have to worry about, normally a fan header would be probably in this area. Sometimes they're down here. So you don't have to worry about the fan getting caught on something. Let's start with the cooler and then come back to the board. The board's very short, obviously. And that's so that you can still get that flow through design that NVIDIA has been pushing. It does mean you're condensing all the board components into one much smaller area. So I could see potential where if you could do a true like for like, which we really can't, but if you could do a true like for like, you might see that this design could potentially be worse than spacing things out more, but then the card would be bigger. For people who are complaining, initially we talked about this before also, about the 12-pin not being on the end of the heatsink, like all the way over here, for example. This is one of NVIDIA's decisions that we are actually in favor of. The reason is, if you've been complaining about the cable not being all the way over here for cable management reasons, that is certainly a valid thing to complain about. But if they moved it, it would mean they'd have to do a 2060 style thing, which we can show a cut of the 2060 teardown we did. Basically, the 2060 had its connector way off over here, and it was with massive soldered in wires. And it was almost impossible to disassemble that card without breaking something if you weren't careful. So this is actually a decision that we're okay with. Even though it's worse from a cable management perspective, it's way better from a disassembly and maintaining your own hardware without help perspective. So there's the cooler. Let's see, Coldplate, that's going to be, that feels like it might just be aluminum. So shiny copper plate, of course, that's our copper Coldplate. It looks to be maybe 2 millimeters thick. So there's a split right in the middle there. You can see where the copper cold plate is. It's probably soldered or welded to the lower plate. And I'm actually not sure as of this instant if there's a vapor chamber in there or if it's just heat pipes, but we'll take a look and figure it out. You can see heat pipes though. So there's one heat pipe down there. That's going to be a 6 mil. Just double check. That's a 6 mil heat pipe. Another 6 mil here, another 6 mil here. As we always state, you want them to cover as much of the GPU as you can, and all three of these converge and cross right over the GPU. So it looks like the coverage is pretty good. This heat pipe is routed, I think, down. Oh, you can actually see it cross over. So this heat pipe, it crosses in right there. There's a gap in coverage here. Heat pipe's going through there, and it's either, I think it's covering right here on the plate to get some of the heat away to the other side. But it's also right over where we've got, you can see this is where the MOSFETs are for that, for the VRM. And actually the VRM this time is not split as much. It's mostly on one side, and that's primarily the IO side. So this is most of the VRM right here. And we placed some thermocouples to measure that. For memory, the memory is, it looks like mostly in contact with this this plate here. So we've got the two, is that the top of the card? Where am I? Yes. 2 top modules, then 3 modules over on this side, which actually are not sandwiched between a VRM and a GPU this time because there's no massive VRM over here. So that'll help with the memory thermals on this side. Typically, these run kind of hot because they're flanked by 2 hot components. Most commonly, it's the ones near the slot, though, which is this side, that run the hottest. And that's simply because they're down where there's poor airflow, there's air getting trapped under the GPU, stuff like that. So these have some overlap where there's a very slight amount of contact to the copper as well, but mostly it's all going into this base plate. So we are back to kind of a base plate design, except it's not secured to the PCB separately. It's attached to the cooler. That provides some structure, but it also allows for more area to soak heat without necessarily investing as much money in its capabilities as opposed to this central plate. The central plate, you can see, is actually very smooth. We're going to have the Coldplate levelness and pressure testing in our review, but let's go ahead and clean this off now. It's still the same very hardened thermal paste this generation for like everyone so far. MSI's actually was okay. So normally the thermal paste viscosity is more of a matter of how the paste is made and what its composition is, and not so much the duration. If we were talking these cards have been in a warehouse for a couple years, then a softer paste could harden over that time, or a lot of thermal cycles could harden the paste, but we haven't put it through that much yet. So I think it's just the paste they're using. You can see the machining marks on this. It is a pretty nice looking cold plate, to give NVIDIA credit for that. And we'll measure the flatness as soon as this teardown's done. So that'll be in the review. But you can see the machining marks where it's going like that. Oh, okay, I can see the cooler design now. I want to remove this cooler. So I'm guessing it's the same thing as last time. Last time, yeah. So there's a clip in there, and probably one in there. To get this out, it's a 2-way, or at least a 1-way clip. You're gonna need to wedge it open. This is what took me the most time on the original teardowns. This design's really easy to install because they just drop it into place. Really annoying to remove, which is unfortunate because you will need to remove it if you ever replace the fan, if there's a fan death, which is again the most common type of failure in any video card, although still not that common. Fans live a pretty long time normally. Typically they die if it's like not well maintained, bunch of dirt in it, dust in it, and it is it's got a lot of resistance when it's trying to spin, heats up the bearings. So you can re-lubricate the fan, or you can just buy a replacement. The only reason NVIDIA can get away with this complex design is because it doesn't have to buy the GPU from a middle person, or from itself really, and for the most part. Whereas the board partners obviously have to buy the GPU from NVIDIA first. It's like a puzzle in a video game once again. Okay, well, it's a hell of a lot of metal. But as we've learned, looking at the partner model 30 series cards, just having the most mass, obviously, doesn't mean best for cooling. So there's the housing. This is not intended to be functional. It actually does get pretty warm when running, just because there's some contact and some trapping of heat. Could be leveraged intentionally to be an additional heat sink if NVIDIA wanted. I don't know what sort of regulations you get into where it'll definitely be too hot to touch if they intentionally sink things into it because it's an aluminum unibody frame. So if it's used intentionally, they'd probably have to put a hot sticker on there somewhere, but a little bit more surface area, not a ton. As you can see, this part is in fact cut out, so some air might be able to get through. I'm just trying to look and see if that's mostly accommodating the base plate. Let's take a measurement. Okay, I think it actually might be almost flush, it looks like, with the heat pipes and the plate down there. You can see the copper on the heat pipes too. So it looks like it is coming almost all the way down, and there's this additional plate, which is just, it looks like another fin, but I can see it's got some rivets in it. I think that's just a straight up plate. Yeah. Yeah, that's like a plate that's designed to block flow, I'm pretty sure. So this is riveted into the side, and it comes all the way down. You can see right here, it terminates right there. So that's blocking flow from one side to the other. It's actually a good thing, in theory. That should mean less hot air recirculation coming out through the fins, although this time the fins are oriented this way instead of diagonally like the other design, but the air would still find its way kind of out here. And if you didn't have this plate in here, well, I guess since they're oriented that way, it's not as much of a concern really, but it should help kind of control where the air is going, just like this plate here. So fin orientation naturally is preventing some cross flow, which is a good design. It just means that a lot of this air, for whatever does exhaust out of the fin stack as opposed to out the back, it's going to get projected into this housing. So this is somewhat clever if you look at it. We've seen a lot of problems where if you de-shroud coolers, the performance will improve a lot. We saw this with XFX especially. And that's because a lot of the time the shroud will trap the exhaust when the fins are oriented vertically. NVIDIA is still not doing a true vertical orientation. They're doing a diagonal. But you can see here, so first of all, the fan has a cage around it. This will prevent a lot of the air from getting out there. But as we saw in our Schlieren imaging, where we took air density gradient measurements around the cooler, you saw that a lot of air would still come out the sides just down past the housing. So a lot of air is still going to come out here. And NVIDIA, actually, again, significantly better design than last generation, which was a horrible design for the most part. NVIDIA has terminated the shroud here so that the air can actually get out there. So that's kind of surprising. We don't see a lot of care taken for reference designs normally for things like that. So that's good. That can get out without hitting the shroud. And then this side, where there is a shroud, so there is still some blockage here, which is unfortunate. But this side, they've rerouted the fins to go left to right so that the air can get out the I/O plate. And as a result, there's a blocking plate, again, right here. So you're not going to have exhaust going into the housing. So that's actually a pretty carefully thought through design now. Unfortunately, they throw it all away right here because they got to get their GeForce RTX logo into the card. Otherwise, how would you know what it is? And so this is going to exhaust into that part of the shroud. But for the most part, most of the air should be going straight down. Not quite in a conical pattern, but it should be a bit straighter down and through the card because there's no resistance on the on the other side of it. There's a thermal pad. So that's a decent design on the housing. Pads are going to fall off again, but let's go ahead and take these fans out. So some more tools from the GN toolkit on store.gamersnexus.net, although it doesn't have the Torx 9 or 10 or whatever it is for those initial screws. So unfortunately, you will have to remove the cooler from the card if you ever do have to replace a fan on your own. They're not doing a pin-to-pad design yet. It looks like it's 4 screws. So it's the same as FEs from this generation. So reason you'd have to remove the cooler, and unfortunately also the unibody, which is annoying, but I just showed you how to do that, so it shouldn't be too hard for you, is because this ribbon cable needs to be rerouted, and it's also glued. And it's a bit concerning to remove glued ribbon cables because they're so fragile already. I would probably advise a heat gun, generally speaking, and if this doesn't free easily, then that's what I'm going to go get. I'm just going to heat this to about 100 degrees, probably a little under actually. Let's go for like 80 degrees Celsius. We just want to warm it up. We don't want to melt it, so much easier. Look at that. Wow, that's so much easier. All right, so that was about my heat gun's in Fahrenheit right now, so it was set to about 180 or so Fahrenheit. Obviously 212 would be 100 C, and we were well below that, so that wasn't too bad, but I do wish NVIDIA would stop using glue permanently. Fan, if you're gonna replace it, it's an AVC fan for the model, and model name is DAPC0815B2UP004. That's the model. 12 volts, 0.6 amps. So if you ran these at 100% speed, you'd be at a couple watts each. You'd be at like 7 or so watts, top of my head. each, so 14. So you actually, if you're at 100% speed, you're going to throw away a lot of your power headroom for boosting and overclocking. So if you're trying to push an OC, you should probably run these actually at a lower speed and get an external fan on it instead. Okay, so that's the cooler. Fairly dense solution overall. Standard heat pipe cold plate design, ultimately. Nothing too fancy on the underside. All right, board. So for the board, so the memory is GDDR6, not X, so it's not the new stuff, but a bit more affordable G6. We're gonna find out the brand in a second. I think that might be Samsung. We're gonna send board photos to BuildZoid for PCB analysis. See if the board itself's any good. And the brand is Samsung on the memory for G6. So I think that is going to be most of it. The PCB analysis, again, will be done in a separate video if we run one. But pretty densely populated, short PCB. Could do a single fan design. I could see potential ITX designs built around boards of about this size. Benefited by the fact that there's only so much memory, so it doesn't take up extra space. The VRM is fairly simple, so a lot of potential here for ITX designs on 3070s. Okay, let's clean the GPU while we're at it. So this is a different GPU than the 3080 and 90. Smaller in size. Always got to be careful removing paste around the edges like that because you could potentially rip off an SMD. So it is called an NVIDIA GA104-300-A1. So GA104 and then -300. Sometimes they'll have like a 350 or a 200 variant for different SKUs on the same size silicon with things fused off or features removed. So that's the model for the GPU. And then for the size, this should be public at the point you're seeing this, the actual die size. But we're going to take a quick measurement here. This is not the actual for reals die size, but it's pretty close. For real die size, you need to get under the diffusion barrier, which we're not doing today. 20.6 by about 20.6, so it's square. And one more thing we'll take a measurement of while we're here is going to be the hole positioning. It's very strange on this one because it's wide. So that's going to be actually kind of hard to measure here. If you're doing water cooling, this is what you'll need to know. That's, wow, really. That's 70 millimeters. That's huge spacing. And center to center, that's about 47, 48, somewhere in that range. Just getting 47 on that. So there's your hole spacing if you're doing some kind of water cooling solution. That's going to be a somewhat unique one to find sizing for. The 3090, 3080 are more square, so Allen 2 pots would need a different adapter for this if you wanted to run one. Water cooling, you just have to wait for the vendors to come out with something. So that's it for the teardown. You might need a heat gun, or we'd recommend one if you're going to take the fans out because those cables. They're pretty easy to remove at the lower, moderate temperatures to just unstick the adhesive they use. So probably advisable to use a heat gun if you're going to do that. It's easy to rip those cables otherwise. But yeah, that's about it. Not hard to take apart this time. The screws are mostly the same size. They've got primarily a TR Torx 9 or 10. Again, my bits have been mixed up a bit. And then Torx 6, which we have in our toolkit for the 4 screws on the retention plate, and then a couple Phillips for the fans. And that's pretty much it. So easy-ish disassembly, not great accessibility to the fans, which we always ding people for. I'd like to see better accessibility for that. Good opportunities for small form factor cards, and otherwise PCB analysis will be up separately. And so that's going to be it for this one. Thanks for watching. As always, subscribe for more. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net to grab a mod mat or other items from our store, like our mouse mats, and we'll see you all next time.